The humid Iraqi night clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing, heavy with the scent of dust and the distant, acrid tang of burning trash. To the terrorists who had dragged her from her vehicle, she was just another Western hostage. A journalist, they assumed, or maybe an aid worker. They saw the tremor in her hands as they bound them, heard the catch in her breath as the rough burlap sack was forced over her head, plunging her world into absolute darkness. To them, she was pure fear incarnate, a victim who would soon be a bargaining chip or a brutal message to the infidels. They didn't know her name was Sarah Jenkins, and they had no idea that for the last 12 years she had gone by a different designation, Operator Viper, a former active-duty member of the United States Navy SEALs. The blindfold was their first mistake. It wasn't just a tool to disorient her, it was a weapon they were handing her. In the world of special operations, the loss of one sense doesn't create panic, it supercharges the others. As they shoved her into what she deduced was the bed of a pickup truck, the rough grain of the metal under her fingers, the specific pattern of the truck's vibration over potholes, the murmur of voices, she cataloged it all. She noted the accent of the man giving orders, local, not foreign fighter, and the approximate number of captors from the shuffle of feet and the slamming of doors. 4, maybe 5. Amateurs. Professionals would have used zip ties, not the coarse rope that bit into her wrists, but gave her just a millimeter of friction to work with. Professionals would have used a hood, not a burlap sack whose weave was loose enough to allow microsuctions of air, a detail that would later save her life. Back in Coronado during the crucible of Bud's training, instructors had a saying, "The only easy day was yesterday." They pushed candidates beyond exhaustion into the cold Pacific surf until their core temperatures dropped and their minds began to shut down. It was there, during the infamous Hell Week, that Sarah learned to find power in powerlessness. She learned that when your body screams at you to stop, when hypothermia makes you want to curl up and sleep forever, you find a quiet room in your mind. You detach the observer from the participant. As the truck bounced along what she guessed were rural roads, she retreated to that quiet room. The fear was still there, a distant thrumming, but it was no longer in control. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the terrified hostage. She was Viper, and she was gathering intel. The truck finally stopped. She was yanked out and marched into a building. The air changed, cooler, musty, with the underlying scent of unwashed bodies and old lamb fat. A safe house, then, not a formal military installation. This was good. It meant a smaller guard presence and a higher chance of disorganization. They pushed her to the ground and she heard the clink of chains. They shackled her ankle to what felt like a heavy radiator pipe. Overkill for a trembling woman, she thought. Their arrogance was palpable. For the first few hours, they left her alone. This was the isolation phase, standard operating procedure to break a prisoner's spirit. They would let her imagination run wild in the dark, let the fear metastasize. What they didn't know was that Sarah's imagination was running tactical scenarios. She was mentally mapping the room from the sounds. The drip of water was 10 feet to her left. The scuttle of a rodent was near the far wall. The murmur of her guards was coming from behind a door directly ahead. She worked her wrists against the rope, not frantically, but with the steady, patient pressure of a hydraulic press. It was about micro-movements, creating slack one fiber at a time. The door finally creaked open. Heavy footsteps. The leader. She could smell him. Cheap cologne and cigarette smoke. He squatted in front of her and she felt the heat of his breath through the burlap. "So," he said in English, thick with arrogance, "the little journalist. You are our guest now." He yanked the sack off her head. The light was dim, a single kerosene lantern, but after hours of darkness it seared her eyes. She blinked, letting them adjust, and got her first look. The man was bearded, with a cruel mouth and dead eyes. Behind him stood two younger men with AK-47s, their fingers a little too close to the triggers. Nervous, even more amateurish. "I am not a journalist," Sarah said, her voice raspy from dust and disuse. I am a teacher. The leader laughed, a dry, rasping sound. They are all teachers, or journalists. You are all spies. He backhanded her across the face. It wasn't a devastating blow, more of a test, a way to establish dominance. Sarah's head snapped to the side and she tasted blood. She looked back at him, her expression carefully blank, but her eyes were the giveaway. They weren't filled with the tears or terror he expected. They were the flat, assessing eyes of a predator watching a lesser animal. For a split second, something flickered in his own gaze. Confusion, unease. He recovered quickly, snarling, "You will tell us who you work for. You will tell us everything, or you will beg for death." Sarah just looked at him. In her mind, she was back on the obstacle course at Coronado, climbing the slippery 6-foot wall they called the Slide for Life. She was exhausted, her muscles screaming, but she reached the top. She always reached the top. "I have nothing to tell you," she said. He hit her again, harder this time, splitting her lip. Then he stood, gesturing to the two guards. "Make her understand her situation." He left, and the two younger men moved in. They were boys, really, probably not even 20. They were full of the swagger of power, but their eyes were unsure. They took turns kicking her, aiming for her ribs and kidneys. It was painful, brutally so, but she knew how to take a hit. She rolled with the impacts, protecting her vital organs, relaxing muscles to absorb the shock. She had taken worse punishment in hand-to-hand combat training from instructors who actually knew how to inflict damage. After a few minutes, they grew bored with their game and left her alone again, slamming the heavy wooden door shut. Back in the choking silence, Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. They had made a critical error. In their rage and their need to feel powerful, they had expended their violence without extracting any information. They had shown her their hand. They were undisciplined. They would be predictable. And they had left her alone, which was exactly what she needed. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in applied psychology. She heard them talking outside her door. The language was a dialect of Arabic she recognized from her deployments. They were arguing about her. The two young guards wanted to finish her and dump the body. The leader, whom they called the Emir, wanted to keep her alive as a bartering chip. This dissension was a crack in their armor. Sarah began to work on it. When one of the young guards brought her a chipped bowl of water, she didn't cower. She looked him directly in the eye. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know you are not like the others." The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and he retreated quickly. It was a tiny seed of doubt. She repeated this with the other one, offering quiet words of understanding, feigning weakness and gratitude. She was painting a target on them, subtly suggesting to their paranoid leader that they might be sympathizing with the prisoner. It was a long shot, but in the enclosed ecosystem of a terrorist cell, paranoia was the most destructive force of all. On the second night, the Emir returned. He was angrier this time, his ego bruised by her resistance. He had the two guards haul her to her feet. "The blindfold," he ordered. "We will try a different approach." They roughly tied the burlap back over her head. This was it, the interrogation. They would likely take her to another room, try to disorient her further, but Sarah was ready. As they yanked her chains free from the pipe, she let her body go limp, a dead weight. It was a move straight out of the SEAL hand-to-hand combat manual, the dead man's drop. The guard on her left, the one she had thanked, was caught off guard. He stumbled, losing his grip. The other cursed, struggling to hold her up. In that split second of confusion, as they fumbled to regain control of her, Sarah's trained fingers went to work. In the darkness, her sense of touch was absolute. She found the guard's belt, found the nylon cord holding a set of keys. With a flick of her thumb and forefinger, a trick she had practiced thousands of times until it was pure muscle memory, she slipped one key off the ring. It fell silently into her palm, and she closed her fist around it. They dragged her into another room, threw her onto a wooden chair, and chained her ankle to its leg. The emir began his questioning, his voice a mix of cajoling promises and vicious threats. He paced around her, describing in graphic detail what his men would do to her. Sarah tuned him out. She focused on the key in her hand. It was small, probably for a padlock. With her thumb, she explored the shackle on her ankle. It wasn't a sophisticated lock, a standard master lock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. It was the kind of lock the SEALs used in training for lockpicking exercises. With her heart rate steady and her breathing controlled, she inserted the key. It was the wrong one, too small. She didn't panic. She withdrew it and began to feel for the keyhole on the shackle itself, using the tip of the key to gently probe the mechanism, feeling for the tension of the tumblers. It was an impossible task, blindfolded and in the middle of an interrogation. But she wasn't trying to pick the lock. She was gathering data. She was mapping the interior of the lock with the only tool she had. The emir was screaming now, inches from her face. She felt his spittle on the burlap. "You will talk!" he roared. In that moment, a new sound pierced the night. It was distant at first, a low thump, thump, thump that vibrated through the floor. The emir stopped screaming. The guards went silent. It was the sound of rotor blades. A helicopter. Not just any helicopter from the sound of it, a heavy lifter, a Chinook. And it was getting closer. "What is this?" the emir hissed. "You! Go see!" One of the guards scrambled out of the room. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear, from hope. The cavalry was coming, but the timeline was unknown. It could be minutes, it could be hours. She couldn't just wait. She had to be ready. The helicopter noise faded. It was a flyover, not a landing. The guard returned, chattering excitedly in his dialect. "It was nothing, Emir. Just a patrol. They are gone." The emir turned his fury back on her, but the momentum was broken. He was rattled. He ordered the guards to take her back to her original room and left. As they roughly hauled her back, Sarah's fingers never stopped moving. Back in the isolation of her room, shackled once more to the pipe, she had her answer. The flyover confirmed it. A search was underway. They were looking for her. The SEAL Brotherhood didn't leave anyone behind. The question was, could she survive until they got here? And more importantly, could she give them a helping hand? The key was useless on the pipe lock, but it was metal, and metal was a tool. She began to scrape it against the concrete floor, a slow, methodical process that was nearly silent. She wasn't trying to cut her ropes, she was trying to create a sharp edge. It took hours. Her fingers bled, but she didn't stop. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the walls, she had a crude, makeshift blade. It wasn't much, but it was something. She began to saw at the ropes on her wrists. It was agonizingly slow work, the metal edge barely abrading the tough fibers. But strand by strand, she made progress. Around mid-morning, the door burst open. It was the emir, and he was apoplectic with rage. Behind him, she could hear the sound of gunfire in the distance, popping and crackling like fireworks. Small arms fire, and it was getting closer. "You!" he screamed, pointing a pistol at her head. "You did this! You are a soldier! You are not a teacher!" He knew, or at least he suspected. The attack on the compound had begun. In his panic, he made his final, fatal mistake. He stepped into her kill zone. He was so focused on the betrayal, on the gunfire outside, that he forgot to look at the prisoner. He forgot that a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. He gestured to the guards. "Kill her, now, and we run!" The two young guards, their faces masks of terror, raised their AK-47s. But they were slow. They were scared. They were looking at the door, at the window, anywhere but at the woman on the floor. Sarah exploded. In one fluid motion, born of 10,000 repetitions in a dozen different training facilities, she used her legs to push off the pipe, swinging her body around. The chain went taut, but she used the momentum to launch herself forward, not at the guards, but at the low table beside her. She crashed into it, sending a tin cup clattering. The guard's eyes flicked towards the distraction for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. With her wrists still bound but the rope now 90% severed, She put her full body weight into a sharp snap of her arms. The remaining fibers tore apart. Her hands were free. The first guard never saw her move. She didn't stand up. She came off the floor like a striking cobra, using the coiled power in her legs. Her right hand, still clutching the makeshift metal shard, slammed into the side of his neck, finding the carotid artery with the precision of a surgeon. He dropped without a sound, his finger convulsively squeezing the trigger of his rifle, stitching a line of bullets across the ceiling. The second guard had a split second to register the impossible sight of his victim rising from the floor like a demon. He tried to bring his rifle to bear, but she was already inside his reach. The SEALs didn't just teach hand-to-hand combat, they taught violence of action. The concept that an overwhelming, continuous assault is more important than any single perfect technique. She grabbed the barrel of his rifle with one hand, pushing it away, and with the other, she brought the sharpened key up and into his eye. He fell back, screaming, his hands flying to his face. Sarah didn't stop to watch. She was already moving, her body a weapon of focused intent. The Emir was backing away, his pistol coming up. He fired, the shot going wide as Sarah dropped into a low crouch, sweeping his legs out from under him with a powerful kick. He crashed to the ground, the pistol skittering away into the darkness. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. The predator had become the prey. She stood over him, her chest heaving, blood, not her own, dripping from her hands. She was a terrifying sight, disheveled, covered in grime and blood, but with eyes that burned with a cold, deadly fire. "You want to know who I am?" she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. She leaned down, grabbed a fistful of his shirt, and pulled his face close to hers. "I'm the danger you should have been afraid of." At that moment, the door to the compound exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dust. 3 figures in full tactical gear poured through the gap, their night vision goggles glowing green in the dim light, their rifles sweeping the room. They were expecting to find a hostage in need of rescue. What they found was a scene of carnage, and a woman standing calmly over the body of their primary target. The lead SEAL, a massive man whose face was obscured by paint and helmet, froze for a nanosecond. He saw the 2 downed guards, the terrified Emir, and the woman who was supposed to be a damsel in distress. Recognition flickered in his eyes as he took in her stance, her controlled breathing, the utter lack of fear. "Viper?" The voice was incredulous, muffled by his respirator. "Is that you? What the hell happened in here?" Sarah Jenkins, formerly of the United States Navy SEALs, looked at her brother in arms and allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Just a little team building," she said, wiping the blood from her split lip with the back of her hand. "You guys are late." They had come to save her. Instead, they found she had already won her own war. They blindfolded her, chained her, and attacked her, thinking she was weak. In doing so, they learned the timeless lesson that strikes at the very core of human conflict. It's not the dog in the fight that matters, it's the fight in the dog. And in Sarah Jenkins, the fight was pure, undiluted, and absolutely lethal. The SEALs didn't rescue a hostage that day, they just provided the cleanup crew.